So I have the pleasure of bringing us home for the last communication for today. We have spent a lot of time talking about where crowdfunding is today, where it's come from, and part of my objective here is talk a little bit about an area of where it could go in terms of some new horizons and what we can do. And one of the things that I want to focus on is this concept of stakeholder equity and how regulated investment crowdfunding can enable a new paradigm as it relates to that. Now, what is stakeholder equity? And I want to describe and talk about it in terms of what it's not, and compare it against shareholder equity. And talk about the definition between stakeholder and shareholder. Shareholder is a very narrow definition of someone who owns equity or stock in a company and they have ownership. Whereas when we talk about stakeholders, we're talking about a broader community. We're talking people who have a vested interest in an organization, a company, but it's not just the financials. They're not just looking for capital appreciation, but they are interested in the success of that company. It could be employees, it could be customers, it can be the broader community. The earth is actually a stakeholder as well. So these two terms are often used interchangeably. They're very different concepts, and it's important that we distinguish them. Now, shareholder primacy has been a concept that we've been living under for about the past 50 years. It really was kicked off with Milton Friedman when he published an article in the New York Times back in 1970, where he said that the primary responsibility, social responsibility of a business is to increase its profits. And so above all else, the most important thing a business should do is focus on its profits. Now, that concept is flawed in a couple ways, because if you think about profits and you extract all the profits out of an organization, you jeopardize its potential sustainability. You might make it less competitive. So the big question is, well, on what scale, what time scale are you trying to make that organization profitable? And it also really puts the interest of shareholders above all other stakeholders, employees, customers, suppliers, community. That was his premise. And after he went around, he talked to this guy was John Carson. For those of you who are young, that was a talk show, it was on at that time. And he would go around and talk about this concept, and he got awards from Ronald Reagan, presidential medals, for spreading this idea of shareholder primacy, along with other sort of theories he put forward. But profit maximization, that was the goal. And people bought into it. In fact, the legal infrastructure sort of followed that as well. And so the problem with that is that, it paved the way for private equity. And in the U.S. today, there are 4,500 private equity firms. About half of them are using following what's called the leveraged buyout model. Not growth, not impact-related private equity, but are focused on basically a leveraged buyout model. And that playbook is pretty formulaic. And so basically, you take some money from your equity funds and LPs, and then you leverage it up with a bunch of debt, and then you go and make an acquisition. And so the target company basically is the one you're taking over, and there are problems with that approach, but there's more realization that this particular model for private equity is one that's not sustainable and has potentially negative impacts on the community. Earlier this year, CfPA interviewed or had a webinar with Brendan Ballou, who's the author of this book, Plunder, and he was quoted and made a comment that private equity is like the 1970s for Pintos. Not every one of the Pintos need to explode for it to be unsafe at any speed. It's inherent in the design of the car that it becomes dangerous. And so there's a growing recognition by many people that a certain type and brand of private equity has that same set of problems. Now, as sort of examples, people are now doing research on private equity owned hospitals, and Harvard Business Review came out with a study earlier this year, was picked up by Axios, where the patient outcomes are worse for private equity in hospitals than the outcomes of regular hospitals. We're seeing it in nursing homes, where nursing homes have been acquired by private equity firms, have higher death rates and poor care. In fact, it's so clear now that there's a connection between that there's a whole industry of lawyers set up sort of ambulance chasing and saying, putting out articles that from private equity firms by nursing homes, residents die, and they're there to help just prosecute that. I mean, it's bad enough of a problem that they realize private equity buys a nursing home, there can be bad outcomes. So again, in certain industries, we see that there's not a positive outcome with certain types of private equity. Why is that? A lot of times there's too much debt to run the company. The private equity firms themselves can extract huge fees as a part of being strategic to the company. They focus on cost cutting because they want to flip this thing eventually. So looking at how to squeeze and make it as efficient as possible. A lot of times it's just how they can reduce the cost for an interim period. And then finally, they're using a tactic called dividend recapitalization, where they take on a lot of debt, pay it out to investors when they can't flip the company. And that essentially becomes problematic for long term. What we're seeing happening is that private equity owned firms are 10 times as likely to go bankrupt as those that are. Now that's pretty damning if you think about it. So this efficiency of capital not really happening. It's actually hurting the sustainability of a lot of companies. Now, this whole concept of shareholder financing, which has dominated our landscape for 50 years, it's been questioned. And about 5 years ago, the Business Roundtable came out, and there was a letter signed by 181 CEOs that said, we're going to have to redefine the purpose of the corporation. It is not about shareholder primacy. We have to have a commitment to all stakeholders. And this is not a bunch of hippies. I mean, this is the Business Roundtable, right? And they're the ones who are signing on to this. We have to move away from shareholder primacy. We have to be focused on stakeholders. The stakeholder equity, not the same thing as private equity. So if you think about it, if you take some of those same business principles and the same approaches that people use, the financial mechanisms for putting private equity in play, you can actually put something called stakeholder equity in play. And there's a group of people who are working and looking at this, and they put forth a manifesto for the stakeholder equity economy. And it basically says it's an economic model that values all stakeholders, employees, customers, communities, the planet, alongside the shareholders, not necessarily mutually exclusive, and these things can work together well. And the idea is to help support businesses in a way that those businesses are sustainable. So if we look at the private equity playbook, and we start looking at the capital stack in the way that the LBO private equity folks have traditionally done that, we can say, okay, let's look at that debt layer. In the past, it just take random bank debt. Why can't we substitute in something like crowdfunding to that debt layer and replace ownership by the crowd as opposed to third-party banks? And why can't we take that private equity layer and turn that into employee ownership or some other sort of form of ownership? The point is to reconfigure the capital stack in a way that's better for the community. Now, why is that possible? One of our former presidents and vice chairman, he said customers have more money than VCs. Economically, it makes sense in certain types of transactions. If a company is feasible, you can actually think about moving the ownership structure to the crowd and away from the private equity. Now, there's an area where it's been very overlooked. A lot of people, the Jobs Act, the startups, initially 90% of the companies that were trying to do this were startups. I think now, with some of the stats that we've seen from groups like Woody, they say about 50% are startups. There's actually operating companies who are in this now who are doing it. There's also a whole other category of companies that haven't really been touched that will be good candidates for this, and that's an area of divestitures. So every year in America, according to Deloitte, there are about $350 billion of divestitures that take place. And those transactions are about $121 million each, on average. So these are broad numbers. Okay, P&G does $2 billion on something, small deals as well. But the idea is that if you think about what you can do under regulated investment crowdfunding, you can get to 75 million with the crowd. And so, if Congress has its way, if we have our way, it would be $150 million at some point in the future. You can get above the threshold for those averages, where you could come in and you could actually use money from the crowd to do these acquisitions. It doesn't have to be bank loans. It doesn't have to be higher leverage. So the crowd could actually step in a way that it hasn't before. The whole premise of divestiture is one person's trash, another person's treasure. If it's a company or an operating unit where there's customers and they're happy, or maybe it doesn't make sense to be in a particular ownership structure, let's just change the cap table again. So here's really a chance to think outside of at some potential opportunities. This is a transaction that happened It had nothing to do with crowdfunding, but as we look at the lens of what could make sense under this model of applying crowdfunding to corporate divestitures, there was a chocolatier called Sharp & Burger that was purchased by Hershey's and then later sold by Hershey's. It was a $20 million transaction that was acquired. People say it was probably about the same amount when it was sold. So 50 years of having gone from being the bar. Imagine that someone had stepped in and said, okay, let's turn that into a crowd-owned company. You could very easily run a campaign where all of the wrappers for that consumer product had a QR code that allowed you to buy or purchase and say, hey, there's a crowdfunding. You like this chocolate? Become an owner. And so there's an example, and this is only a $20 million transaction, some sort of regulation is actually more than enough to cover that. There are lots of examples of consumer products that could potentially be owned by a crowd, and with the loyalty of that ownership, it's going to strengthen the balance sheet and the strength of that particular product because the owner really wants to continue to consume it. Divestitures, again, non-core underperforming entities, and they have standalone viability. So, again, part of the purpose of this is just to expand our mind into new avenues, new areas, new places where crowdfunding can be applied. This is a great tool that we've used to date. There's a lot of people who are looking at how to get innovative about it and use it different ways. This is a potential avenue where stakeholder equity, which is enabled by regulated investment crowdfunding, could actually stand up and be an alternative to some of the private equity that we've seen, types of transactions we've seen in the past. And so I wish, as I think about this particular conference, I wish we'd been more successful at getting some students here, some business students here, because I'd love them to get passionate about this and be the next generation. Because 30 years ago, I had my 30-year reunion from business school, and it was interesting during some of the cocktail table talk. One of the individuals who did very well for himself going into private equity was talking about that with some of our colleagues, and he's done it in a very ethical way. I wouldn't characterize him as sort of the type that are destroying companies, but he made the observation that when we first started out, no one knew what private equity was. I mean, it was sort of, it wasn't a term that was being used, and no one was really focusing on that as an area for really specializing in business school. I feel that the same thing is true here with what we're doing. In the future, this is an area where stakeholder equity will be a place that explodes in the future. And of course, crowdfunding is a tool that can potentially make that happen. So with that, I'll close. I'll ask you folks if you get a chance to go look at the stakeholder equity manifesto and just background information on this. So this ends the general session. And so, Christie, everyone.